Hello, I'm here to present the study No Learning Loss in Sweden during the pandemic, evidence from primary school reading assessments. This study is conducted by Eva Hallin, Henrik Danielsson, Thomas Nordström and Linda Fält. While many countries chose to close their schools during the pandemic, in Sweden, however, primary schools were kept open. This study aimed to investigate potential learning loss in reading development during the pandemic compared to previous years in H1-3. Open schools did not necessarily mean that the pandemic did not affect learning of the youngest students in Sweden. The Swedish pandemic strategy included strict recommendation to stay home if the slightest symptom of illness were present. Increased teacher and student absence and the resulting difficulty with continuity in teaching and learning, as well as the anxiety and stress from experience a pandemic, might still have affected teaching as well as student learning negatively. The results showed that word decoding, that is the technical aspect of reading, and reading comprehension scores were not lower during the pandemic compared to before the pandemic, which can be seen in the graphs on the slide from one of our analysis. Actually, the scores from the pandemic were a bit higher during the pandemic. We could also see that the proportion of students with weak decoding skills did not increase during the pandemic. The proportion was very similar between years, and in general, the proportion of students with weak decoding skills was somewhat lower during the 4 pandemic test periods. Finally, we found that students from low socioeconomic backgrounds were not especially affected by the pandemic. The scores for both word decoding and reading comprehension are consistently slightly higher in the test periods during the pandemic than previous years. So the conclusion is then that there was no evidence of learning loss during the pandemic versus previous years. The results seem robust. There is little data loss during the entire period, meaning that the pandemic year is comparable to previous years. This means that keeping primary schools open benefited Swedish primary students. Individual students might have been affected by the pandemic in Sweden, but no learning loss in reading is evident at the group level. An important note, though, is that this group has very low incidence of severe COVID-19. Thank you very much for listening.